No, I'm Rosemarie Doherty. I'm the manager of the Maritime Museum here in Greencastle. I suppose I've spent probably my entire life dedicated to history and heritage, and I suppose it all came about from a kind of a passion that was encouraged and fostered in me from my own granny, who was now 90 years old. But she was somebody that had a strong belief in kind of ownership of place and, people, and a kind of a pride in their place. And part of it would be that for her and her people, they always kind of felt that they fought hard to survive in a kind of a really rural, isolated, rugged landscape. And she kind of made it her mission in life to kind of instill that in us. Now, I can't say that the same passion was instilled in my brothers and sisters, but it was always something that really made it, was very important to me. So probably I started probably with a school project back when I was about 9 or 10, where my teacher, Miss Gillespie, entered a Donegal Historical Society competition about farm implements, and interviewed my granny about it at a very basic level. And from that moment on, I was just absolutely hooked on the whole history of the area. So after that point, there was a very basic notice put in the parish bulletin to say that there was an idea to start up a history group in Clonmany, and that group was kind of to be headed by Marius Harkin. So I persuaded my father to take me to the parochial hall in Clonmany for this meeting, and I would say he was thoroughly depressed at the thought of having to spend a couple of hours at such a meeting. And I went in there, and there was a group of about 30 people who were really passionate about history and archaeology and about the history of the parish. And I sat there and was absolutely blown away at the number of people who were interested. So it was out of that first meeting with Marius and various others that the McGlinchey Summer School was formed. So that was something that kind of progressed over a long number of years. But having attended that, been involved in the setting up of that first McGlinchey Summer School, one of the first things that happened was that a Christian brother called Brother Tom Connolly gave a talk about the place names of Clonmany Parish. And he had interviewed extensively back in the 1960s Neelis Ann Friel, who was the last native Irish speaker of the parish, about the place names. And what I had discovered from Brother Connolly's notes was that in my own townland of Dunaff, he had recorded 144 place names within one townland. So for me, that was absolutely fascinating, and I just couldn't let it go. So immediately I set up along with Ian Wright and Brendan Kearney and a few others, the Uris Place Names pilot project, which with the aim of identifying the location of all these place names. So I headed off on my bike with a sheaf of maps and appeared at the doors of older people and started saying, can you tell me where this name is? Can you tell me where this place is? Can you give me a translation? And it kind of went from there. So another part that kind of was developing at the same time was my interest in traditional songs and singing, because my granny's first cousin, Marianne Canny, she died when I was about 11 years old as well. And she was probably the first person in my life, that was really close that had died, because we would have visited her every day with my mother and granny and things like that. And my granny says, she had so many local songs, I wonder where they all went. They'll be gone now that she's died. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I can't believe, this existed. So I was pointed in the direction of Jimmy McBride, and he was able to say that he had recorded Marianne extensively. So that kind of got my interest in local songs and singing. So once I had got those songs of Jimmy, I once again set off on my bike and pestered older people about songs and songs of the area. And every time you went to one person, they would say, and this other person knows a song about whatever. But probably the thing that really got me wildly passionate about it was that somebody had said to me that there was 3 songs written about my grandfather back in 1962. So my grandfather was drowned in 1962 off Binion. My father would only have been 4 years old at the time. But for me, it fascinated me, the idea that there were such songs written, about something so local and so personal So again, I made it my mission to go and find these songs and get them recorded. So that was kind of the start of that bit of interest in that area as well. So, it was simple things like the songs, for some reason, seemed to tell the true story of the events more so than newspaper reports of the time. So like that kind of made me think, hang on a minute, there's a lot to be said about taking the local people's information and the information from songs that might be dismissed sometimes in the main historical record. So after the point of kind of having that strong interest, became involved obviously in the McGlinchey, the traditional singing weekend in Inishowen, and then eventually was at a point of going to college and decided to become an archaeologist, as you do. So out of that developed the Lands of Owen project, which through meeting the Bernician Studies group who were doing some archaeological research in Inishowen, we set that up, and we began looking at the kind of focusing on the archaeology of Inishowen and looking, instead of bringing experts to talk about their area of expertise, the aim was always to bring experts to talk about the importance of Inishowen's archaeology, to give people their own kind of feeling of ownership and pride in what was here in Inishowen. So instead of looking up to these people, we wanted these people to look up to us and our heritage. So it kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. So that's kind of where I was at. I worked as a kind of commercial archaeologist with various companies for about 15 years. And when the opportunity arose for a manager or curator here at the Inishowen Maritime Museum, I kind of thought, this is just perfect timing. I had the interest in the maritime heritage, I had the archaeology background, and I just thought it was time to be at home instead of roaming around Ireland for years. So I thought it was a good place to be. So here I am. So my family itself wouldn't necessarily be a fishing family, but I think whether you're from a fishing family or not in Inishowen, you can't avoid being part of a maritime community. It's just part of life. So I suppose they would have all fished and farmed like everybody else in Inishowen without actually being fishermen as such. And in fact, up until it's only in probably the last 30 to 40 years that people have actually become fishermen as such, because it was simply just a way of life, a way of survival. So my granny's, my mother's family wouldn't really particularly have fished, but would have, like everybody else, depended on seafood and fishing to a certain extent for survival. And for example, when the pier at the slipway at Dunaft down in Sludden was constructed, like my grandfather would have been one of the people that would have been involved in that scheme to build that pier. So that's at a basic level. My grandparents on the other side, again, wouldn't necessarily have been fishing people, but my grandfather would have fished, with local men, as would have been kind of standard back in the day. So it was in 1962 that he went out fishing for lobsters with two neighbours, his John McGilloway and his son John. So they headed off, and unfortunately they didn't make it back. So it was one of those things that, although not directly, I wasn't there to experience it, but my father was only 4 at the time, but the impact that such a tragedy has on a family is kind of lasts forever in a way, because there's always that kind of sense of loss and kind of fear of the water and kind of attitudes around the sea that develops out of that. But they never were quite sure what was the cause of their drowning. It seems that the boat did have an engine, so it was surmised that ropes got caught in the propeller caused an explosion in the engine. Because I think, as far as I know, the pieces of plastic were washed and that were kind of melted and stuff. The unfortunate thing about it was that the 2 McGilloways were not able to swim, and therefore their bodies went straight down and were recovered immediately. Which is a sad part of the story, is that my grandfather was supposed to be a very good swimmer and managed to swim quite close in. But unfortunately, because he was so far away from the wreck, it took the full 9 days for the body to rise. So for my father, who was 4 at the time, he has no memory of what actually happened. He has no memory of what it was about, but he just remembers their house being full of people for days on end, and he could never quite pull it together. And at a time like that, you know, people back in the 60s, there was no counselling, there was no, you know, thought of, you know, how these children are comprehending this tragedy. But like for them, I imagine it was had a major impact on their entire lives, because there was 5 of them and the eldest was only 10, and my father was the youngest at 4. But I suppose from a young age, I would have kind of made it my mission to kind of research, you know, because that was always in my nature, how the story unfolded and what happened, and the series of events that happened, you know, around that time of that tragedy. And so I had all the newspaper reports that I'd gathered from various bits and pieces, and I read all the, you know, information that was there. And bits of it kind of didn't seem to make quite sense to me from the snippets I'd heard from local people. And there was always a hesitancy with like the local community to talk to me or to my immediate family about the tragedy, because I would say there was an element of, you know, we don't want to be, you know, bringing this up. It's such a tragic event, and you know, it's too close. But from, you know, interviewing people and from getting the songs, I kind of realised, you know, there was a lot, bits and pieces of the story that were totally inaccurate in the newspapers. And one of the examples is that in the newspaper reports, there was always this picture of the fire brigade from Derry all lined up, you know, as heroes that had gone down the cliff face to carry up this body of my grandfather. But when I carried out the interviews, I realised that it was actually a local man who did that, because none of the fire crew were brave enough to go down on the rope and recover the body and bring it up. And like, while they were all photographed in their uniforms looking perfect, like the man who had actually gone down, his neighbour who had gone down on a rope and recovered that body, was never even mentioned, you know, because it was just, it didn't fit the story very well for the officials. But it was things like that you realise that local people have the stories, and the songs kind of filled in little details as well. So in the recording of each of the songs, for everybody I recorded a song of, I had probably an hour of chat about, you know, the events. And it was just really fascinating to learn so much in that way. And it was also interesting for my family, like my father and that, who had never heard these bits as well, to have that filled in for them, because at that stage I was just that generation that was a step away, so people felt a wee bit more comfortable to give that information to me. You know, while Ireland is recognised for poets like Yeats and all the rest, that actually the people of Ireland, the ordinary local communities, are the people who brought that poetry and fluency of language to these people like Yeats, because like within our own communities there is an ability to use language to express things like no other country in the world. You know, sometimes with very few words they can express great sadness or great happiness or whatever. And at a time when, you know, a lot of people in society like Oris or Clonmany were barely literate, like they did have the ability to sing, and they did have the ability to make songs, and they had this creativity about them. So that was their way of expressing their grief and their story. And like these were sung, you know, regularly up until recent years. And people knew the people connected, and knew the families, and knew everything around it. So like probably the first song that I came across that really, you know, struck a chord was probably the drowning song of 1890, about the Dunaff drowning. So I had heard that, I heard my granny talk about it, but I heard the song from Dan McGonigal on the Isle of Doe, and that was about probably about 25, 30 years ago now. But that song was about 4 boats who had set out from Dunaff, looking to go and head for a good catch. There had been seemingly a lot of warnings in the days prior, where like nets that had been laid out in fields had blown up off the fields randomly without any, you know, particular one being in the area. But they went out, and at that particular night there was 9 drowned on one boat from Dunaff. So they were leaving from Dunaff, and they knew after a short time that 3 of the boats had reached the other side at Fanad, because they always had a signalling system. You know, back before mobile phones, people were a lot more creative and probably more sensible. So they would always light a fire to let you know that the boat had reached the other side. So 3 fires went up, but they knew that the 4th one didn't go up, so therefore there was, a problem. So the 9 of those men were lost at that time, and one of them in particular was the first person to ever be buried at the graveyard in Norris once it opened. But there was 9 people on that boat, and the song names them all, and everybody knows that they left families behind, they left children behind. And the newspaper reports, again, for some reason it doesn't really capture that sense of community. It doesn't capture the whole story and the whole kind of essence of the magnitude of the tragedy and the effect it had on everybody. So a song like that really kind of stands the test of time and is something that is there forever as a memorial to the people who were lost. There's other things like the songs, there was sentiment and people, because they were so close to one another at that time and so close to the land and to the sea. And while I was doing the Clonmany Coastline book, I came across one song by complete accident, because at the same time I was doing some work on my granny's home place, and on the flag at the doorstep it was written P. Duffy 1927 or 1928. And when I looked, I asked my granny, I says, what was that about? And she goes, oh, that was my uncle. He carved his name on the doorstep on the flag the day before he went to America. He emigrated. And she goes, he never came back. And she goes, I have a feeling, there was a drowning at that time as well. And she goes, I have a feeling he wrote a song before he left. But she goes, I don't know now who would have the song. But she goes, I'll see if I can find out. So just by coincidence, I was talking to Mac Tam MacDonald, and he said, who would also be a first cousin of my granny's, and he sang the song for me. So back in 1928, there was a group of men from Balaworski and Fanet who went out and were lost at sea. And that the night before he left, I'd imagine partly the sadness and kind of emotion of leaving to emigrate, as well as the, sadness of this tragedy, because that would have, Fanet and Dunaff would have been quite close, at that time, connected through fishing communities. But the impact that had on him inspired him to write this song before he left, and Mac Tam still sings that song to this day. So it's things like that, the connections are just unreal, from me seeing a name carved in a door flag to somebody emigrating to a song about, a tragedy. And in recent years, since working here in the museum, I came in contact with some people from Balaworski who have been working on piecing together the story of that drowning tragedy, and just by coincidence they happened to walk in and say to somebody at the desk, oh, there was this boat went down, there was Balaworski men, and the staff said, no, never heard of it, no idea. And they mentioned it to me, and I was like, oh my God, I know a song about this. So it's just, in that split second, I was able to fill in an entire community on the other side on Fanet with the information about that tragedy that they weren't able to piece together. So it was just an interesting way of things coming around again. I was approached back in 2009 about compiling a book about the Clonmany Coastline. In fact, that wasn't the title I was given at all. It was, I was asked basically to produce a kind of a tourism book about sites around the coastline of Clonmany, and I thought, I have no idea where I would start on this. The funding was to come through the Salmon Hardship Fund, which was being looked after by the Inishowen Development Partnership. And I think ultimately the aim of the fund was to, in a way, kind of compensate for the kind of decline in the salmon fishing and for the families who kind of lost their income from salmon fishing. So I agreed, but kind of felt that the project would have to really reflect the fishing and maritime community of Clonmany, rather than just solely being a kind of a thing for tourism purposes. Because while tourism is obviously a valuable thing for Inishowen, to me, once communities have their value in themselves and their place, tourism will follow. Because once you have instill that sense of pride in a place, people will come to see it. So I kind of said to them that I suggest that we change the dynamic of the book to kind of reflect the true feelings and the true past of the community of Clonmany. When I suggested interviewing the fishermen, anybody that I spoke to said, oh, fishermen won't talk. They're not going to tell you any information about what they've ever done because they never want anybody to know. So I found out that it was actually the complete opposite. Most of them, I went to them, they said, oh, I wouldn't know anything about that. But in the majority of cases, I ended up with probably over 4 hours of interviews with each individual that I spoke to. And there was no hesitation at all. And like none of them even asked for a copy of what I was going to write. And all of them were very happy with what was produced. And the ultimate aim of what I was doing was to present it in their own words and the way that they would say it. And I talked to one, my man, Mickey Bryan Kearney over in Leanan, and even simple things like he talked about one of the drownings that happened at Leanan Bay where some of the bodies were never recovered. And like when you sit and you talk to that man who's been sitting there all his life looking out a window at that bay and you know he describes he looks out and he says, you know, we have all these visitors and tourists who come to this beach and say, oh my God, it's a beautiful beach, you know, it's fantastic. And he goes, you know, so often, so many of us look out our windows and think that's our graveyard. And you think, you can't, that's their feeling and that's their place and that's their thought of it. So for all the fun days and, you know, jet skis and, you know, swimming in the tide, for them, there's a lot of days that they see it like that. So you can't take that away from their experience. So that was important to me to tell the story in their words. And the book as well, I thought it was important to address the kind of the stuff to do with folklore and stuff, because in coastal communities there's always a strong emphasis on folklore. And any rural community really, there's a lot of folklore around the whole thing. So we were lucky in Clonmany Parish because back, I'm not sure exactly what year, but there was a book produced by Cosh called Scian na Caithfillatun. And that was a series of folktales that were collected from a woman called Peggy Sharkey in Tulla. So she would have been one of the last native Irish speakers as well in the area. And we're very lucky to have a huge collection like that was, you know, recorded at that time. So thankfully, Jimmy McBride had put together a CD and a booklet with those stories because they were originally in Irish and he had translated them into English. Because although my Irish would be moderate, it certainly wouldn't be good enough to translate those to the standard that he did. But they were stories that we had all heard from our childhood. Everybody in Oris has heard the story about the man who, you know, heads out to the cave to gather barnyas and winkles, you know, on a spring tide, heads around the back of the Naff Hill, and then the tide comes in, and of course he's trapped there until the following year. So he survives, you know, eating seafood, and he's lying on a dry bed of wrack up the back of the cave. Eventually makes his way out a year later to discover that basically people had assumed he had died, his wife had remarried, and everybody was kind of in shock. But he's greeted by somebody who sits him down to a big meal and to celebrate his homecoming, and unfortunately he dies from being overfed. So after surviving a year in a cave, surviving on seafood, he comes back and ends up dead because of a big celebratory meal that he was served. So it's stuff like that we've been hearing since we were children. And then there was other stories like, you know, I imagine a lot of the stories are kind of standard around the coast of Ireland, but they're always adapted to, you know, where you are. But there was supposed to be a man in Leanan who was out gathering seaweed to use as fertiliser in the fields. He sees a big black opening in the water and sees a huge big seal appearing, and he was afraid that it might attack him, so takes out his pitchfork and sticks it in the seal, and immediately the seal turns into an elderly gentleman with a long grey beard. So the fella takes off running home, tells his parents, and his parents say, please don't mention this to anybody ever again, just no mention of it, pretend it never happened. So the fella stuck to his word and never mentioned it, but you know, was very well aware that this had happened. Years and years later, he's on Tory Island because there was a storm and they had to take shelter in Tory. And he is greeted by this man who comes up to shake his hand, and he says, "Do you remember me?" And the fella says, "No, never seen you in my life before." And he says, "Do you remember that day that you stabbed a seal at Leanan?" And the fella says, "No, I have no memory of this whatsoever." He stayed true to his parents and said, "No, I have no memory of this." And your man lifts his shirt and shows the marks where the fork pierced the seal in the side, and he says, "You do remember me, I'm that man." He says, a spell was cast on me. I was turned into a seal, and it was that if a drop of blood was fallen from me, that I would turn back into a man. And here I am. And I want to thank you for saving me from that spell. And the fella just looked and still remained denied that he'd ever seen him. But that's the kind of story that was quite common around the coast. So I suppose, like, while the men would have been the ones that would have went to sea and kind of did the fishing and did the kind of heavy lifting side of things, like the women would have been very much in the home preparing the seafood and looking after, you know, the families that were there. So, like, in terms of gathering winkles and seaweed and slook and carrying moss, the women would have been actually more involved, you know, at that time in collecting seafood around the coast. So while they wouldn't have actively been on board ship, they would very much have been, you know, doing the hard work in the house. But like my granny, for example, would have all the time been, you know, boiling winkles, and, you know, we'd spent our lifetime eating dulse, and the women would have been drying it and getting it organised for everybody. But when I was doing the book, one of the interesting things that I found was, you know, there's, you know, when we have cookbooks and TV programs now, there's all these measurements of how the cooking's done and, you know, the correct temperatures and all the rest. When I approached my granny to ask her about these things, it was like, I'll throw a cupful of this in and a bit of this and a bit of butter, and, you know, and it made absolutely no sense. So even in the Clonmany Coastline book, like, to be honest, it's pretty vague, because when I tried to pin her on how I should do this to do it properly, there just was no measurements. It just didn't exist. And while I was watching her, she was doing it so fast that I had absolutely no clue as to what was actually going on. There was such health benefits to these foods that were just taken for granted. And to be honest, like, they weren't counted as luxuries to the coastal communities in Inishowen. It was just a means of survival. So an interesting thing is that, you know, we would have lots of kind of, you know, English people coming on holiday to areas like Uris now and staying and have holiday houses. And they were always fascinated by the fact that they could go and get some crabs or lobsters. And, like, most people in Uris wouldn't be that keen on eating lobster, because they would actually prefer crab. But, you know, they find this such a delicacy and they're so happy that they can get it. Whereas the people would nearly throw away a lobster in favour of a crab toe. Seaweeds would have been used commonly in the past in any coastal community, I suppose. But dulse would be eaten regularly up until the present day. So that's kind of the purple seaweed that you dry out and you eat. And there's various health benefits. Don't know the exact details. But the likes of carrageen moss as well is gathered, and that is strained and then put with the milk and then set and eaten as a dessert. And one of the interesting things about carrageen moss is that carrageen moss was used in the first sweets on the first Aer Lingus flights in Ireland, because the sweets were actually made at Binion House. So they were created there, and I think they were coated in chocolate, and they were first served on Aer Lingus flights on one of their first flights. So that was something that Clonmany is kind of famous for. Then you have other things like sloke, which is the green kind of stuff, that seaweed that grows kind of around rocks and stuff. And that was quite commonly used for burns and stuff like that. And to this day, there's still, you know, some of the medical stuff that's used for burns uses the same element. There's other, like, in a way, in the past, people had more understanding of the uses of these things as well, because there was seaweed, mainly wrack, that was gathered, say, at like Ballyliffin, and that was actually exported at a time when there was trains leaving Ballyliffin back in the early 1900s and taken away, and it was the gluey or gummy stuff from the wrack was used to make glue for the Sheppey Glue Company in England. So in a way, parts of Inishowen were more advanced at that time, that had trains and were exporting their goods far, far away for great purposes. But barnyas and winkles would be commonly eaten, and well, not so much these days, but they're still gathered out in Uris, and there's still a few people that still gather them and send them away. I actually don't think that people are going to make a living from the sea now, and I think part of the problem was when people were starting to use the sea as a means of making a living rather than as a means of survival. So I suppose in a way, if the sea had to have been used around the coast as a means of, sustainability rather than for making a fortune, it probably would have been possible that we still could be continuing to use it in the same way. There's certain things, I suppose, even like as simple as the gathering of dulse, because it doesn't be picked as often now. When the dulse isn't picked regularly, it grows out and grows kind of into rough, coarse dulse that can't really be eaten. So out in places like Dunaff, like a lot of the dulse is growing out and it's not really suitable for being picked now. So like a handful of people who might go out for a week in the summer is not enough to make that, come back in the way that it did. For the next generation, I don't know if they're that interested in using the resource that they have. You could probably still adequately maintain a family using just basic methods of fishing and farming and using seafoods, but I can't see it going back to that. And in terms of an industry, I suppose you're talking in the 1950s, 60s, we had a slipway and a pier built by the OPW at Dunaff. And like in recent years, that hasn't even been used as a pier in the last 20 years. The last boat to go from there was probably about 20 years ago, because they were fishing salmon, and once that ended, there was just no viability to keep their boat there and keep using it. So that has actually fallen into a terrible state of disrepair, and there's barely a roadway down to it at the present time. So it's hard to know, unless it's for leisure activities. I can't see that it can go back to the way that it was. But then on the other hand, I suppose there are some more boats at Leaden in recent years, and the pier has been expanded to a certain extent. So yeah, well, I would say probably in recent years that younger people are, I suppose, starting to take more of an interest in their environment and in their place. And even through my works with the Lands of Owen and various things like that, like I found that over the years, and probably the last 5 to 10 years, and maybe even more so since COVID, where people had an opportunity to stop. There was nothing going on, there was nowhere to go. And like, people watched TV for the first few months and it was all a novelty, and we could all sit in our house and have our glass of wine and not really care because we didn't have to get up in the morning. But like, after that time passed, people thought, we want to get out and explore our own area and our own coastline. And like, that's where we saw people then going down to the pier in Dunaff, taking out kayaks or starting to go hill climbing, within their own area, and taking note of what was around them. And like, all of a sudden I had people asking me questions about like a rock. God, was there a name on that rock? And I felt like saying, I've been telling you this for the last 30 years and nobody's listened, and then all of a sudden you want to know what the name of the rock is. I felt like screaming, but at the same time, it was great to see that people suddenly were taking an interest. So I think that maybe as time goes on, and in a world where everything's becoming more expensive and more commercial, like, I think that maybe people are going to start to take a step back and kind of value what they have on their own doorsteps and kind of take a look at protecting their environment and looking after it. Because even, I suppose, with my work in the Inishowen Rivers Trust, like, you become so aware of like polluting the waters around in our rivers or around our coast, like the impact that has forever. It's not just an impact for this generation or the next one. It's like, once it's gone, and like, sometimes the damage can't be fixed. So I think that bit by bit, if we instill that value on our landscape and on our coastlines and our environment for these younger people, that maybe someday they'll actually listen and realise.